be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSE Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, ICANN 75 Insights from the Kuala Lumpur meeting. My name is Christy DeMeo-Ziegler, and I will be your moderator. Joining us today is Gretchen Olive. Gretchen is the Vice President of Policy and Strategic Account Management for CSE. For over 2 decades, Gretchen has helped Global 2000 companies devise global domain name, trademark, and online brand protection strategies, and is the leading authority on ICANN. And with that, let's welcome Gretchen.
Thank you, Christy, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. As usual, we have a lot to cover. Never a shortage of material when it comes to ICANN meetings. So let's just briefly go through our agenda. As usual, I see a few new names, which is wonderful. So we'll do our usual ICANN overview to make sure everybody's on even footing, and then we'll dive into the different policy development processy updates at ICANN. We'll also talk about a topic that was discussed at ICANN, both internet fragmentation and emerging identifiers, as well as DNS abuse, and of course what is on the mind of the Governmental Advisory Committee, or the GAC. So let's jump into it. So first of all, just for our new attendees here, ICANN has a public meeting 3 times a year. This is meeting C, which is usually the one that happens in October, kind of like mid to late October, early November. It did get moved up a little bit this year, so it was in September. It's typically the kind of the longest of the meetings, and it's really where ICANN, it's their annual general meeting. It's where they kind of showcase the work to the broader global community. Here is an organizational chart of ICANN. We often will say things like the ICANN community, or ICANN org, or the board of directors. So this gives you a sense of like who these all are. If you look across the top, you'll see kind of that blue, darker blue box that goes across kind of the 3 rows of boxes. That's the board of directors. They are, you know, just like any other corporate board of directors. We also have ICANN, the organization, and then all the way to the right-hand side, you'll see some gray boxes, and those gray boxes are different advisory committees that advise ICANN as policymaking is happening. One that we focus a lot on in this webinar series is the Governmental Advisory Committee, or the GAC, and we'll talk a little bit more about them later in the webinar. But we usually focus most of our kind of summaries around the work that comes out of the GNSO, or the Generic Name Supporting Organization. This is the group that's made up of volunteers from the registrars, the registries, IP interests, business interests, ISPs, also non-commercial users and not-for-profit. So this is really kind of where we focus our efforts here in our analysis. So let's jump to the ICANN board. Just before the meeting, ICANN 75, ICANN announced that they had a new chair of the board and vice chair. So Martin Boderman stepped down from the chair position, and Tripta Sinya has taken the helm. And this is actually the first woman chair of the board, so very exciting. And then also Danko Jevtovic took on the vice chair position, with Leo Sanchez stepping down. So a little bit of a change in the leadership of the ICANN board. I also give you a little group picture there to put some faces to the kind of the sense of who the ICANN board is. We talk about him a lot in these webinar series. So, alrighty, so let's jump into the different policy development processes, or PDPs, as they're often referred to. The first one we'll cover to kind of warm up is the transfer PDP. This one wasn't launched by the Generic Name Supporting Organization Council, so the GNSO, again, that kind of middle blue box that I talked about. They launched this 2-phased PDP in February of 2021. As you will quickly note, most of ICANN's PDPs are multi-phased. It doesn't seem like everything can get accomplished in one phase because they're typically pretty large issues. So this one also is phased. This is looking at changes to the policy, basically to determine if there are changes to the policy that are needed to improve ease, security, and efficiency of the inter-registrar and inter-registrant transfer process. So with one of the things we've been talking a lot about through the last, 4 years is GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. That was something that really kind of like collided with ICANN and kind of everything that is WHOIS. So everything that relates to WHOIS, including transfers, was affected by changes brought about by the GDPR. Really, before GDPR, ICANN, I would say, kind of acknowledged that there were data privacy laws around the globe that were in conflict with their WHOIS policies and kind of contract provisions for registrars and registries, but they didn't really do much about it, but GDPR really forced their hand, and so therefore there's a number of things we'll talk about today that's in the PDP process that's sort of like the aftermath of GDPR. So this PDP is up and going. Like I said, it's in multiple phases. The first phase is looking at the gaining and losing forms of authorization, auth info codes. Second one, change of registrant, phase 1B, and then phase 2, looking at the transfer emergency action contact and reversing transfers in the dispute resolution process. So there's a lot kind of bundled into this PDP. The current status is the phase 1A initial report was released shortly after the last ICANN meeting. Public comment was open until August 2nd. They did receive significant comments in kind of 3 areas. One was around the elimination of the losing form of authorization, or FOA. So that's the notice that goes out to the losing registrar, and the replacement with notifications to the registrant name holder, RNH. So there was a lot around that. There was also a lot around this new transfer contact, or the TAC, as well as transfer restrictions after initial registration and transfer. So that's like the 60-day lock thing that happens after names are initially registered or transferred. So that's where a lot of the comments kind of focused. The work group is going through those. They've also simultaneously started to work on phase 1B, which is around the change of registrant. So, basically they're in deep. They're very in deep into this PDP at this point. The second PDP that we'll talk about is the IDN EPDP. So let me translate. IDN is internationalized domain names. So those are domain names that are not in Latin script. So think Chinese characters, Arabic characters, Japanese characters. That's what an IDN is. An EPDP is Expedited Policy Development Process. So this has become kind of the new way of doing things at ICANN since the work that was done after GDPR went into effect, where the first EPDP happened. Most of them have just been PDPs in the past, but now things seem to be getting on the expedited track, which kind of requires things to wrap up within a year. This IDN EPDP team, they're looking for them to give the GNSO Council some policy recommendations on the definition of gTLDs and the management of those variant labels, as well as IDN implementation guidelines. There's kind of like a list here of the 7 topic areas where they're expected to provide recommendations. The IDN space is one that is definitely a bit challenging. Certainly a lot of technical aspects of this, and there's a lot of people with a lot of history in IDNs. So this is, an IDN, this is a PDP, I should say, that really is kind of highly specialized. Where are they right now? Basically, they're telling the GNSO that they're going to publish their initial report in 2 chunks because this is so kind of big, this issue. And like I said, there's a lot of kind of detail and technical detail that goes along with that. So they're going to focus part 1 of the initial report, like the first chunk, is going to be about, you know, the charter questions and recommendations related to, you know, a top-level variant management. So what does that mean? Like, this is IDNs after the dot when we say top level. Part 2 will be the, you know, what should be the charter questions and recommendations related to second level variant management, so the things before the dot, so IDN before the dot. So, you know, they gave a number of reasons to kind of chunk it. I think they make a lot of sense. And the initial report, at least on part 1, is expected by the end of this year. So that, you know, kind of enables us to see some outputs quicker here. Again, this is an EPDP, and that's really the reason to do an expedited, is that we need to kind of get to it quickly. Don't want this to kind of churn on. So let's at least get to the top level variant issues, and then we can deal with the second level. So this now takes us to the WHOIS, or temporary specification, sometimes called Temp Spec, EPDP. This one has a very long history. It's been going on for 4 years plus. So the Temp Spec was something when GDPR became enforceable in May of 2018. ICANN didn't have kind of the answers that they needed to have for WHOIS policy. So they put in place something called the temporary specification that kind of allowed, you know, redaction of some information, allowed registrars to really skinny down, if you will, the WHOIS output. This was something that was only supposed to be in place for a year, and technically the temporary specification was in place for only a year. There kind of was a policy, an interim policy that was then put in place after, so kind of the same things but by a different name after that year. But this is what we're talking about when we talk about the WHOIS and Temp Spec EPDP. So this was initially divided, another multi-phased PDP. Phase 1 was about the collection and handling of WHOIS contact data and sort of requests for that data. And Phase 2 was about who should get access to the data by registrars, registries, ICANN, and other third parties like law enforcement. And then at the end, there was kind of a Phase 3, but they called it Phase 2A, kind of tacked on to kind of deal with the very detailed issue and kind of legal challenge of natural versus legal person, because as you probably know and remember, GDPR is about protecting personal information. And so, you know, when you have a legal person versus a natural person, you know, there's some differences there in terms of the application of the GDPR. You know, corporate information or legal person, you know, information is not protected under the GDPR. So anyway, there was the third issue where we talk about that, as well as the potential of using a uniform anonymized contact email in the WHOIS record. So that's what this PDP is about, or really EPDP. Phase 1, after they kind of got this thing up and got through the first year, provided the Phase 1 work team provided the recommendations, largely got approved by the ICANN board. Then ICANN put in place an implementation review team. That was in June of 2019 to basically implement what's going to be the new registration data consensus policy. This team has struggled. We've talked about it before on this webinar series. There's been some behavioral issues that had to go to the Ombudsman's office. There's been a shifting regulatory environment, you know, different cybersecurity and privacy laws being implemented all over the globe. And there's also been policy and stakeholder dependencies. Like in this kind of space, there are not enough hours in the day, there are not enough volunteers to do all the work that needs to get done with urgency. And so that continues to be kind of a drag on getting some of these policy discussions completed. Honestly, many are growing very impatient, and understandably so. I mean, we have sort of a broken WHOIS system right now. It's very hard, if not impossible, to get behind the redactions. This is really impeding the ability for fraud and security investigations, for IP enforcement. It's a big problem. And the GAC, the Governmental Advisory Committee, has been particularly impatient and really beating the drum publicly about, like, let's get to a solution. We need to get to a solution. It is in the public interest that we get to a solution. So the IRT kind of regathered themselves, and at ICANN 73, so a couple of meetings ago, or the meeting at the top of this year, they kind of put together a project plan that showed the policy work really wrapping up in early 2023 and sort of implementation stretching out about 18 months beyond that, which would bring us into the end of 2024. So if we look at that, it's kind of a little diagram that was in one of the ICANN presentations. That's kind of how that would map out. Late August of this year, the IRT did deliver the draft registration data policy language, which is great. It included profile documents that sort of spelled out how the WHOIS should look. Public comment is open on this until the end of October. So you can go to the ICANN website, you can go to the public comment section, you can see the report, and you can provide comments. Really what they're doing is seeking input on two matters. One is the actual policy, and the second is sort of some of the policies and procedures that were impacted by this work. So what I mean by that is a lot of things at ICANN are interdependent, meaning in the policy area. It's hard to find a policy that, like, you could just read on its own without having to go and be referenced to other policies and kind of bring that in, be incorporated by reference. And so that's kind of the policy and kind of structure of how ICANN policy is. And so when you really kind of like change significantly one policy, it will have impact on many other policies. And so the WHOIS is really central to so many of different policies, everything again from transfer to dispute resolution, etc. So there's a lot to do there, and in a few slides I'll show you quite honestly the kind of depth and breadth of the policies that will be impacted. But in the meantime, let's before we get to that, let's talk about this registration data policy kind of implementation and like what it looks like before and after. So, the temporary specification, which then became the interim policy, gave some instructions or waivers in some cases of information that needed to be published, but there was a lot of kind of detail not there. And so this new registration data policy hopefully will give us a lot more clarity and detail around things like collection of information, transfer, publication, redaction, retention. So that's really the goal here, is to accomplish that, to make things much more straightforward and to properly balance the interests. Here's just a kind of a quick excerpt, if you will, of some of kind of like the policy. This was also from one of ICANN's slides. You can see on the left side, it's sort of like a quick overview of what's in that policy, and then just sort of an excerpt of sort of like how detailed we're getting. So it gives you sort of a sense and appreciation of the work that's being done. If we look at this at the high level, like kind of looking at current landscape into what the post landscape might look like as long as kind of things stay the same, one of the things I think that will be the most notable and noticed will be, when it comes to the various contact fields within the WHOIS. So the registrant contact is being kept. We'll talk a little bit about some modifications to the kind of the fields within that contact record, but that contact will continue. The admin contact is being eliminated, and the tech contact is being reduced. And we'll talk about there's going to be a transfer contact or a TAC that's going to be part of this. So, there are going to be changes, and some of them more noticeable than others. As I mentioned, or just on that last slide with the registrant organization, we're going to try to normalize that data a little bit. Right now, it's like you can have an organization name, you can have a person's first name or last name. It's kind of a mixed bag when it comes to like who the registrant organization is. We're going to kind of work to normalize that and to make that a little bit more clear and make sure that the notifications to the registrant and how and when the value must be published. There's some changes to data retention. There's also some disclosure of there's kind of this concept of reasonable access, with requirements for considering and responding to requests. So, there's a lot more here to come. This is just very, very high level, but we'll be talking about this more in detail as we kind of get closer to final. I mentioned earlier that ICANN policies, like when you start tinkering with something like WHOIS policy, it impacts a lot. And so this is a list of the policies that have been identified that are being impacted by this new registration data policy. So, some policy is more work than others to do in it, but it will definitely spawn a lot more policy work that needs to be done. Doesn't mean we're going to not move forward with the implementation of the registration data consensus policies, but there will be kind of downstream effects. It's a little bit like a domino, line of dominoes. So there'll be more changes that will come from this. There's three. So three of the policies that are not impacted. So definitely by far more that are than are not. But good to know there's a few off the list. So that's phase one. Now on to phase two. So phase two, they issued their final report. The EPDP phase two team issued their final report in August of 2020, so 2 years ago. Initially, the GNSO approved it. The ICANN board, however, kind of took a look at it and had a lot more questions, I think, than were anticipated for sure. And so at that point, ICANN kind of instituted a new requirement for these types of PDPs that were going to kind of spawn new systems and processes. And they created this new operational design phase, or ODP, and a part of that is an operational design assessment, which it's a feasibility study. That's really what it is. It's trying to understand, like, is this doable? And in the top of this year, in January 2022, the ODA was delivered to the ICANN board, and it was eye-popping, let's just say that, in terms of like cost and time and effort, and whether or not at the end of the day, after going through all that time, cost, and effort, was it really going to be in the global public interest? And I think there definitely was, definitely a global public interest to solve this problem of access to WHOIS, but whether it was the best solution or the most workable, pragmatic solution for ICANN and the ICANN community, not convinced. So was pretty heartbreaking to a lot of the people who worked on that work group, a lot of time and effort and, debate spent on that, but ultimately not a good feeling about its potential. So as a result, ICANN, obviously, this ODA was shared, and the GNSO kind of said, wait a minute, we probably need to kind of regroup here. So they created this small team of council members on the GNSO, along with EPDP team members, and they kind of came together end of January this year. In April of this year, the small team delivered a preliminary report, and I think what they said is, look, maybe we're going too big too soon. We really need to maybe slim this down and put together a proof of concept to evaluate and test assumptions. And so the GNSO Council told ICANN to kind of hold on consideration of what was, the kind of the prior recommendation, which often went by SSAD, which means Standardized System for Access and Disclosure, and basically said, let's pause on that recommendation, or those recommendations, and ICANN, could you help us design something that's maybe like SSAD Lite for a proof of concept, like maybe we need to crawl before we walk, before we run. And so the ICANN board did direct the ICANN org, so the organization that's ICANN, the president, CEO, and its staff, to design a proof of concept. They have come up with something called the WHOIS disclosure system, and so let's talk about that. So sorry about that. So this is what it looks like. The system is scaled back, like the whole kind of idea is scaled back, really with the intention of trying to simplify the process for submitting and receiving requests and to be more cost effective, right? So it's trying to get to kind of the root of what we're trying to accomplish with the disclosure system. I don't think there's many people in the brand community, if any, that would argue there needs to be a way to get behind the WHOIS that's sort of GDPR compliant for legitimate purposes, things like IP enforcement, law enforcement, security and fraud investigations. And we got to make this as easy as possible and as cost effective as possible, at least at the first instance, until we are able to really, I think, learn from that and know what needs to be addressed. So that's, this little diagram gives you kind of just a very high level kind of picture of what ICANN kind of put together, what's now called this WHOIS disclosure system. Now, the kind of features of this system, it models off something they already have called the Centralized Zone Data System, or the CZDS. This was a system they created as part of the new gTLD program implementation, and it basically, it's where all the WHOIS information gets stored for the different new gTLDs, and then there's the ability to make requests. And so this is a system that sort of already exists, technology system that already exists within ICANN. So, trying to use something they already have and then they try to extend it from there. So the system is really trying to connect requesters to registrars. Now that's different than what the CZDS was initially kind of proposed for, but in this kind of implementation of using the CZDS as sort of the backbone of this WHOIS disclosure system, registries are not envisioned to be system users. So the system handles data requests for the gTLD registration data. CCTLDs and other kind of like non-contracted registries, we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a little bit, they're out of scope. There is email verification but not identity verification. And any communication between the requester and the registrar would take place outside of the system. So like things like clarifying questions, requests for additional documents, data disclosures, et cetera, that's going to happen in what is sort of this proof of concept would happen outside of the system. And there's definitely challenges with that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And this would not be integrated with registrar systems. So there's no like automated connection or anything like that. This would be a standalone system. There'll be logging, which is really important. I don't think, anyone would argue this is important. So things like system logs for the request of information, system logs for the registrar's decision, and then date and time stamps for all activities. So that definitely, needed and included, which is good. Registrar participation. there's no specific contract requirement right now that basically says registrars would have to do this. They are looking, when I say they, ICANN.org is looking at how to encourage participation, and that's one of the things they want to discuss with a small team if implementation of the proof of concept moves forward. There's no billing function in here, so ICANN would completely fund this. There's privacy by design, which is important. Things like data minimization, not holding data for any longer than necessary, and then sort of security around the data. But let's remember, like this, this got unveiled at ICANN 75. This is a very high-level design, a very kind of like quick and dirty, like we could try this. There's a lot, I think, still between the, the lines here that needs to be figured out. And the design may need to be amended, on sort of technology requirements, best practices, as well as sort of other principles around security and privacy by design. So, not fully baked, an idea, and something that, is now currently being very actively discussed. So, if you kind of had to put these two things side by side, so the original proposal of the SSAD, which is that standardized system for access and disclosure that we kind of worked, the ICANN community worked on for, 2+ years, next to this very quick proof of concept idea, which is the WHOIS disclosure system, you can kind of see the comparisons, 9 months, probably, so let's say 9 months to a year for development timeline, where SSAD was 3 to 4 years. Development costs, you're looking at, around $20K, but definitely much less than 20 to 27 million. That was SSAD. Post-launch costs, looking at about like $70K, so for some like licensing of hardware and software and things like that. Compared to 14 million to 107 million, that was a very wide range in the first place, but nonetheless, even if we take the bottom number, still much different. Complexity, 3 types of actors, 3 subsystems, 2 processes. The SSAD, 8 types of actors, 8 subsystems, 60 processes. And then fee, no fee versus a fee structure. So the question, I think, still remains is, while this looks really appealing, is it the right solution? Is it, is it just because SSAD is really hard and really expensive and will take a long time that it's not the right solution? Or is it that maybe we need to start small and learn, and maybe this WHOIS disclosure system is the way to go? So just to kind of summarize key proposed changes from the SSAD model, it doesn't include a central or governmental accreditation authority, so the WHOIS, WHOIS data disclosure system does not have that. It does not include accreditation of requesters, does not include identity verification of requesters. It does not include an abuse investigator, which I think is a thing that needs a lot more discussion. It does not include a billing function or any fees to the requester, which is good. There is no obligation or expectation of automated processing of certain requests by contracted parties, so like that no integration piece, where before SSAD did contemplate that. So there's a lot to kind of take in there. There are risks definitely to this WHOIS disclosure system. We've got the usage risk, that we don't really know what the demand for this will be, and I think that's part of, quite honestly, I think SSAD, it was the big solution, and I think this, assumes big, number of requests, and I don't disagree that could be very likely the case. I think we just don't know. I mean, if we look at after the temporary spec went into place and in May, June of 2018. After that, for a good year and a half, many folks were trying, security investigators and IP enforcement trying to contact registrars. Some of them had forums, some of them had little systems you could enter a request, some of them you just had to email. People tried to get, for what they thought were legitimate reasons, behind the WHOIS and get the information to complete fraud and security investigations, enforce IP rights, law enforcement purposes, and quite honestly, very mixed bag success, and often not success in getting that information. And so I think it's hard to judge how widely this would be used based on that experience, because it was such a negative experience. There was just why do you continue to request and not get any answers? So usage, definitely a risk. System risks, the question of, is this WHOIS disclosure system kind of vulnerable to malicious and nuisance submissions because there isn't that abuse investigator? There's no effective way to ban abusive users. There's legal risks with ICANN taking this on. Would this make them kind of a litigation target? Could they, have more liability for processing personal data? Terms and conditions probably would need to be, updated. And then just sort of registrar participation, which we've talked about. There is no contractual policy requirement that they participate, and there's no integration. So there's risks. I don't think we have a perfect solution. The question is this the better solution to proceed with, or at least flesh out a little further? And that's what's going to be the discussion, kind of from now into the next ICANN meeting in March. All right, so let's jump into another issue at the ICANN 75 meeting. So there's been a lot of discussion lately about blockchain and internet fragmentation, and so ICANN had two separate sessions during ICANN 75 to kind of, create a forum for discussion. Let's just put it that way. So let's tackle the internet fragmentation one first. So, there's a lot geopolitically going on. There is a lot of discussion, right now we have one internet, and that's, the same internet across the globe, but there are definite threats to that, and the question is that a good thing, is that a bad thing? So ICANN held a session that was really kind of an opportunity to come to common understanding, to kind of level set everybody's kind of set of information. They did publish a briefing paper. What we can do is, if you want to put if you want a copy of that briefing paper, you can put your email and name into the Q&A box, and we will send that to you. I understand on the PDF the hyperlink does not work, but they issued this briefing paper prior to ICANN 75 that was a good summary of the issue and sort of defining and also did a good job of sort of defining what internet fragmentation is. And at a high level, they kind of talked about internet fragmentation kind of has three types. There's technical fragmentation, there's governmental fragmentation, and there's commercial fragmentation. So, I think, blockchain definitely fits into that technical and commercial fragmentation. But governmental fragmentation also, we've seen different conflicts around the world, countries threatening to kind of run their own internet. There's just a lot going on here. So it was a good discussion. It was a start of a dialogue. Here you'll see a little word cloud. This was something ICANN also published prior to ICANN 75, so I thought I'd share that with you. But yeah, it's something that we're going to be, I think, talking a lot more about as we go forward. The other session around what's called emerging identifiers, or in a lot of ways meant to say blockchain, really there was a little bit of this is what blockchain is, but it really tried to be more of a form of sort of discussing some of the challenges around these emerging identifiers. And so, there was, they talked about the Ethereum, which is name service, which is one of the more kind of quote-unquote popular blockchains. And, one of the things that is one of the biggest challenges with the blockchain, is this concept of no revocation of domains under any circumstances. Like, there's no censorship, there's no regulation. You buy it and it's yours. And the blockchain is a very decentralized network. There's very little transparency on what's registered within it. It only works, with certain less mainstream browsers and with special plugins and things like that. But, the question that really kind of was like, I'll call it the mic drop moment, was like, ICANN asked, like, who's going to want to be associated with a system that permits malware, phishing, dangerous fake pharma, and child sex abuse material? I mean, that is the problem. Like, if you can't take that stuff off the blockchain, is that really the internet we kind of experience we want for everybody? And so, some real kind of debate on that. The other issue was around, or challenge kind of identified, was around name collision. So for those of you who were around for the kind of launch of the ICANN new gTLD program, you'll remember applications were taken in the early part of 2012, and it wasn't until late 2013 that like the first TLD from that application period started, began the launch process of all the TLDs that got through the evaluation process. And one of the issues that came up during that period of time and dominated the conversation was around name collision. So just to explain a little bit, within organizations, a lot of times when, technical team is setting certain servers up and routing traffic within the network, they will set up kind of like almost like fictional domain names. So they might use like .home or company name or whatever to just route things internally, because the feeling is that's just internal networking, not for public use or consumption. The challenge is that when the new gTLDs came along, some of those strings applied for kind of were the ones that people were making up and turned inside their network. .home was one really big one, as an example. And so the technical folks in the community kind of pointed out the risks of those name collisions, that there could be data leakage, there could be problems with resolution, and there were mitigation strategies that were put in place to try to mitigate against that and kind of forewarn those who had done those sort of internal networking tricks that they needed to kind of clean up their network, because there could be some challenges with some of these new gTLDs. And so the feeling exists that this could also happen with some of these blockchain extensions, in round 2. What if Ethereum goes and applies for .ens? Okay, probably not as big of a problem as if somebody else gets .ens. And how is that going to, conflict or collision going to be resolved? There's a lot of concern around that. So, the conflict between the blockchain alt roots and ICANN root, as well as between different alt roots. So, still, I think a big issue that needs more discussion. And then there was also this discussion around sort of nomenclature. The world pretty much understands, let's call it a term of art of things like TLD and domain. And there's a certain level of sort of trust and credibility that, on the kind of ICANN internet route, these things, this is what it means, this is the experience that you'll have, this is what you can expect, these are the policies that apply. And there's some concern about, as these different emerging identifiers kind of gain in kind of, I wouldn't say popularity, but gaining kind of the awareness of them, whether or not terms like TLD and domain should apply to them, because there could be some confusion, and there could be some, basically people start equating, the what they're expecting start to deteriorate and not meet those expectations. So, yeah, an interesting conversation. Again, no solution or, like final chapter, but I think it's good that ICANN is at least providing a forum for these discussions. I think it's, their participation in the discussion is important, but I think they also have to allow enough room and space for kind of others to bring their opinions and ideas to the fore. And I think this was, a forum, so that's a good thing. All right, so on to DNS abuse. DNS abuse has been a topic we've been talking about on this webinar series and just sort of CSC as a whole for several years. Look, I think these statements are pretty self-evident. Like, DNS abuse is just chronic. It's growing. It's not going away. The bad guys are always going to be ahead of policy. The problem is magnified whenever we have kind of like outside events, like COVID was a perfect example of that. Natural disasters, I'm thinking now of on the, here in the United States in the Southern Hemisphere, we've had some terrible hurricanes and how that is impacted. There's just going to be bad guys trying to make, cause problems during an already difficult situation. And there's still no common definition of what exactly qualifies as DNS abuse, which, is challenging into itself when you don't know what exactly the problem is defined as. But nonetheless, I do think there was a recent EU Commission study published earlier this year. I've mentioned it on the last couple of webinars. I really recommend you take a read of that. I think it's well done. I think they actually did use some of our research. We do a lot of research and kind of analysis around DNS abuse, try to understand what's going on there and kind of what the bad guys are up to. But there were some good. There's an attempt there to kind of define DNS abuse, which I think is good first step. I also think that, it confirmed that, CCTLDs are less abused than gTLDs and that new gTLDs are among the most abused of the TLDs. So, yeah, there's some definite good findings there. But the question remains, like, what is being done? And, what we've talked about before is there's still this patchwork kind of approach. Everybody's kind of like, we need to do something, but exactly what we need to do is still a big question mark. Most feel that ICANN and the contracted parties, which is kind of the registries and the registrars, need to do more to combat DNS abuse, but there's not a clear path as exactly what more means. The GAC is also working at this. They have a public safety working group. They work, the GAC works along with individual governments, trying to learn from their experiences, things like that. So they're working on it. CCTLD registries have been, sharing their experiences because they are less abused, but they also have recognized they probably need some new rules that they can impose to, mitigate DNS abuse. So with all this going on, the GNSO, the Generic Name Supporting Organization, decided to create a small team on DNS abuse. It is really intended to try to sort of like herd the cats. I think that's probably the best way of saying it, is that everybody's kind of working in their little silos. Let's see if we can pull together and leverage the work that each of these teams are doing. Let's kind of put our arms around it and try to figure out what we need, what sort of tackling DNS abuse means. The small team's work, though, is no guarantee of like there's going to be some policy that comes through ICANN that will kind of address this. So, it's still, I think, in its infancy, if you will. The small team is finalizing its report to the GNSO Council. They're considering input from the community as well as ICANN compliance. They understand and recognize that DNS abuse has a life cycle. And so they're kind of really examining that life cycle to understand, like, at what points in time and what parties are involved at that time that can really do something to mitigate the harm. But, in general, they're kind of bucketing sort of concerns and potential solutions to kind of talk further about into 3 buckets. One is, like, this is a group of things that we can potentially require some policy development work on. This is the group of stuff that is just outside ICANN policy development. And then this is the stuff that ICANN should look at in terms of maybe it needs, something needs to be incorporated into contracted parties' agreements with ICANN. So, I think probably a good start to kind of, there's a lot that's, that could be possible, but I think understanding what's doable and who should do something about it is probably a really good first step. So with all that going on, I think it's one of the things we try to always do is highlight, how can you protect your organization? There's no single bullet here. There's no, one-shot solution. The threat is high right now. There's nothing out there that makes me think that this is going to, decrease in anytime soon. There are many national cybersecurity agencies that have issued alerts, and best practices and guidance and advisories, and, there's a lot to do. We have a domain security checklist. If you would like a copy of that, please put your email and name into the chat. We will get that out to you. So hopefully that can help on domain security, which is a really important part and often overlooked part of your cybersecurity posture. I'll also, give a little bit of a plug here for CSE as a new service that came out a little earlier this year in the spring called 3D Monitoring and Enforcement. It is, I've been in this business for a long time. Domain, kind of watching your brand in the internet ecosystem in both domain names and internet content is very, very hard. The threats, are high. They are looking for exposed surfaces. A lot of these threats are external to your firewall, so your team is really working hard to kind of have the biggest, baddest firewall, but a lot of this stuff happens outside, and sort of understanding the indicators of compromise, or the IOCs, is really important in understanding and kind of being ahead of the threat vectors. So that's what CSE's 3D monitoring really tries to get at. Before any kind of domain monitoring, I would say, is sort of two-dimensional. It's like a flat piece of paper, with some words on it. CSE has built some new machine learning deep search technology. It's proprietary, and really now we can give you a clearer picture. You kind of see that very pixelated picture to a much clearer picture of what's going on and what those threat vectors are and what those indicators of compromise are, and that's the results of the 3D monitoring search. So just a minute about the GAC. So as I mentioned earlier, the GAC is the Governmental Advisory Committee. It's made up of about 180 country territory members at this point. Actually, Saudi Arabia just joined. There are 38 observer organizations. There's about 500 plus or minus participants at this point, delegates. The GAC, really through the new gTLD kind of rollout, really gained steam and really leveraged its role as sort of the overseer of the public good and public interest. But COVID put gasoline on that. And so there's been a huge increase in engagement and participation, and like I said, the organization has grown. At the end of every meeting, they issue something called the Communique. So the GAC, in that Communique, they kind of summarize the things they did during the meeting, and then there's kind of a section of issues of concern and advice for ICANN. And so their issues of importance or concern this time around was around subsequent rounds of new gTLDs. They're still worried, ICANN should not be rushing that. There's issues still to be resolved. Digital inclusion and internet connectivity, there's a very big part of the world that is not included, and there's a huge digital divide, and connectivity is a big internet connectivity is a big problem. Some questions and concerns around ICANN strategic planning. Obviously, this WHOIS disclosure system was unveiled during ICANN 75. They've got a lot of questions about that, but see it as generally as a positive in terms of trying to deal with this WHOIS issue. They just want ICANN to get on with it. DNS abuse mitigation, we just talked about, big concerns there. It affects everybody around the globe. Internationalized domain names and universal acceptance, those are those IDNs I talked about. All the browsers don't all recognize all the different names and the different scripts. Some software has problems processing IDN, so that's the universal acceptance. And the GAC continues to press on ICANN to find, to get better at that and to enable that more, because more than half of the world does not speak or use Latin characters. And then lastly, the accuracy of registration data. My very first ICANN meeting back in 2001, we were talking about WHOIS, and we were talking about accuracy, and 20, plus years later, we're still talking about it, and we still haven't solved the problem, and the GAC continues to beat the drum on that.